All right. Thanks for coming. My name is Alastair MacGregor. I'm a lead audio programmer. So I lead the technical audio team for Rockstar, based at Rockstar North in Edinburgh in Scotland. And I'm responsible for the audio tools and pipeline, runtime engine, and game-level audio features as well. So today I'm going to talk about the audio in GTA 5, which we released in September for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It's by far the biggest game we've ever made, and the ambitious scope and breadth presented plenty of interesting challenges on the audio side, some of which I'm going to talk about today. Obviously, don't have enough time to talk about the whole game, so I've picked out some specific areas that will hopefully illustrate our general approach to combining many layers, complementary techniques, and ultimately trying to create a world with depth and subtlety. I'm going to start by showing a short video captured from the game to give some context to the rest of my talk. That's not the video I decided to capture, but I think it's kind of let down by my driving skills at the end. So to give some background, our audio engine we call Rage Audio, we started development of it in 2005, and it was a clean sheet design for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It's very much designed for the sort of games that we like to make, so large-scale, open-world streaming games. It's evolved massively over the years. We've added loads of new features, but the fundamental concepts remain largely unchanged. I think it's interesting to note that we choose not to have a separate core technology team working on audio. We have a single unified team consisting of sound designers, audio programmers, and audio tool programmers, and that ensures all development is unified and aligned to the game requirements. So we try to ensure that our sound designers can work on one platform and know that their work is going to translate well across any other platform that we target. Obviously, we do use different compression formats, MP3 on PS3 and XMA on 360. So they sound a little different. But other than that, everything will hopefully be identical. So all the behaviors, timing, and also through to the DSP, so reverb and filter responses. It's really important that we keep everything exactly the same across platform. Our tools are designed to work with big projects, many assets, and also large teams of collaborators, each of whom have specific workflow requirements. So a solution that works really well for speech and dialogue isn't necessarily a good solution for sound design. So we see a lot of value in tailoring workflow solutions for the individuals where possible. And on the performance side, as much as possible, we do want to free sound designers from worrying about constraints or resources. Obviously, that's not entirely possible, but it does mean that any feature we develop needs to be affordable by default, and there's no point in providing potentially cool tech if it's too expensive to be used in the game. And because we're making streaming games, we do have to be very careful with disk access and memory implementation. So that leads to certain choices and implementation details. We focus on creating modular assets as much as possible. So we want to create assets out of many small parts rather than single monolithic sounds. That ensures that we get the most variation out of our memory. It also gives us flexibility in the mix, so we can have different components of sounds behave differently over distance. and generally ensure they sit properly in the mix. And in a game like GTA, we obviously have to cope with pretty unpredictable and emergent gameplay situations. So we do rely on very solid voice management so that we can throw lots of things out and ensure that the engine picks makes the best choice on what should be ultimately rendered. So we support about 1,000, just over 1,000 virtual voices, and just under 100 of those are rendered physically. We don't use any manual priority system for this. It doesn't really work for our game. You might think an explosion sound is really important, but if it's the sound of the plane that you build out of exploding 3 miles away, it's probably not as important as the mountain lion that's about to eat you. So instead, conceptually perceived loudness of the listener is the only metric we would ideally use to inform our voice management. We use a fairly simple approximation of that. All of our wave data is analyzed offline as part of the build, and we store a time-varying peak envelope. So at runtime, we track where we are through the wave asset, factor in any environmental attenuation and volume modulation through code and assets, and that gives us a kind of peak level metric. We choose then every 15 milliseconds the 100 voices that are loudest, and those are the ones that are rendered. One of the big changes for GTA 5, we moved away from X-Audio and Multistream onto our own mixing engine. The architecture we implemented for this features support for different PCM types, source types. So we have granular, wave playback, synthesis, that sort of thing. And these can be plugged in at the source level. And then we have a voice which implements filtering and routes onto to the submixes. This means also that we can have multiple voices feeding from a single source. And we use that extensively, particularly in the radio, to allow us to do multi-point emitters. So you'll hear in a GTA game the radio tracks positioned at multiple points in the world, each with different reverb sounds and filtering based on the type of vehicle, whether the roof's open or closed, whether it's a big SUV with a bassy radio or a small family car. And since Max Payne 3, we moved to ambisonics for panning. So we also, in GTA 5, added support for switchable decoders. So that means the user gets to pick in the front-end menu a choice out of 9 speaker layouts, so they hopefully pick the one that best matches their room. And we optimize decoders for each of those to ensure the spatialization is as good as we can make it. So for us, this is a shot of our tools. For us, sounds are modular building blocks of audio logic. We have a toolkit of 31 different sound types, each implementing different behaviors. A simple example would be a random sound, which picks from all of its child sounds one to play at random based on weighting and memory. Multi-track sound plays all of its child sounds together in sync, and an envelope sound plays one child sound, but applies an ADSR-style volume, pitch, filter envelope on top of it. So the flexibility and power obviously comes from combining these different sound types in interesting ways, and as a result, we expect hierarchies to get relatively big and complicated. So we support around 3,000 sounds playing back at once in GTA 5. This is a good example of something that hasn't fundamentally changed since the first iteration of the engine, but we have focused on optimizing common workflow tasks. So the graph view on screen there is a good example where in the first version we would need maybe a few different sounds to create a particular pattern to implement a behavior. Now we have a single sound type which has a few more bells and whistles and makes it easier and faster for a sound designer to get the result they're after. The graphs here are mapping input parameters to sound parameters. And those parameters come in the form of variables, or RTPCs, which for us allow bidirectional control between sounds and the game engine. We expose a number of variables automatically to sounds, things like the position of the sound within the world and the playtime of the sound. We also have a number of global variables that are published, things like where is the player in the world, the time of day, weather information. And if a sound is played on a particular entity type, such as a vehicle, it will have access to a number of variables associated with that, so the mass of the vehicle, for example. Having all these variables exposed automatically means that sound designers can create assets. Regardless of how they're triggered, they can hook into all this rich information and use them as modulation sources or for variation or whatever. And these variables are then mapped through curves or little transform scripts that you can write with our MathOp sound type. And they're typically then hooked up to volume, pitch, pan, sequence timing. We've got a number of endpoints that they can be used for. But we also support sounds driving game systems through this variable control. So this example, the graph on the right there, this is a sound which doesn't generate any audio on its own. It exists just to modulate some variables over time. These graphs have been authored by a sound designer. And in this case, if you play this sound on a vehicle, we're going to use it to override the physics simulation values for the RPM and throttle. So basically, it allows us to create a one-shot sound which is triggered on a vehicle and drives the engine sounds, so a sophisticated response, which we use extensively for cinematic cuts and things like that. We also have a number of more advanced sound types. This one, the Kinetic Sound, exists to map in-world motion to sound variables. We've got a number of different ways to attach sound to objects, whether that's script hookup, animation events, physics. And this sound type allows us to create sophisticated dynamic audio responses without requiring a programmer. So it looks at the object it's attached to, analyzes the motion, and turns that into useful variables. The parachute sounds in GTA 5 are driven through this. So the script hookup is very simple. We just attach sounds to the canopy in the player, and then as you move around, the different forces that are applied are turned into audio through this sound type. So incidentally, it might sound here like I'm trying to put our audio programmers out of work. That's really not the case at all. In fact, we value audio programmers who are audio specialists, core members of the audio team, and the best results come from close collaboration between sound design and audio programmers. But tools like this do allow our programmers to focus on the creative side of things rather than more mundane hookup. So dependable timing for our assets is something we think is very important. We ensure that parameters set across a 30-millisecond game frame are all batched up and applied at the same point on the audio frame. And that includes sound starting. And we ensure any parameter set across an audio frame is batched up and applied on the same sample in the mix engine. So this gives us really dependable timing. We added support in GTA 5 for subframe sample-accurate pre-delays, which basically means you can have a sound delay for a certain number of samples before it's rendered. And coupled with the timing guarantees, that allows us to do really rock-solid timing sequencing. And we use this for automatic weapon fire. So whereas in the past we would have had to choose between a loop, which would obviously be sample-accurate, or one-shots where the sequencing might be a little variable and couldn't achieve very high frequency. Now we have rock-solid subframe sequencing of our weapon sounds. So we support really high fire rates. It sounds great. We also added support for source chaining. So one PCM source can trigger another one to start when it stops with a subframe offset to ensure sample-accurate splicing. And because we support XMA on 360, the hardware takes a little while to start to warm up and generate data, so there's a little bit of latency there. But we also support PCM waves, which obviously don't suffer from that. And on the PS3, the majority of our wave data lives in video memory, which means we need to ask the GPU to fetch the data before we can decode it. Both of these things add some latency, which we compensate for. Again, it's really important if a sound designer creates a multi-track sound with two children, one of which is in VRAM, one of which isn't, or one of which is PCM, one of which is XMA. We want to ensure that they're heard on the same sample rather than being at the mercy of some unknown latency. So GTA 4, going back a few years, was a really large project from an asset point of view. We had around 20,000 metadata objects created by the audio team. These are individual sounds, vehicle tuning data, that sort of thing. And we had around 50 hours of streaming assets. So for us, streaming assets are music primarily and cinematic cutscenes. And 80,000 lines of in-game dialogues. That's not including cinematics. These are all in-game ambient or scripted lines. We don't localize dialogue either, so these are all individually written lines of dialogue. GTA 5 moved things on a bit for us. Yeah, 75,000 metadata objects, almost 90 hours of streaming content, and almost double the number of lines of dialogue, so over 158,000 lines of dialogue. And it's worth bearing in mind that both of these titles shipped on the same hardware, so that took quite a lot of optimization effort to make that happen. As part of the push to ensure predictable memory usage and avoid fragmentation, we use a fixed memory map for our wave data. So that means we can compare GTA 4 to GTA 5 distribution of wave assets in memory. Overall, as you can see, they look incredibly similar. It was quite a surprise to us putting this slide together and realizing how similar they were. Our streaming buffers did increase. That was just due to some technical stuff on the game side. But it's pleasing to see that our vehicle budget decreased from about 20% to about 15%. And that's pleasing because the vehicles sound considerably better in GTA 5. So we were really happy with the improvement in quality. The fact that that also came with a massive memory improvement is very gratifying. You might be interested to see that our collision wave data is pretty massive. It's one of the single biggest chunks. And that's because for us, a rich collision set is really important to creating an interactive and dynamic world. We want to make sure if you knock something over, it sounds appropriate and has plenty of variation. And as I mentioned, almost all of this is in video memory on PS3. So when we talk about dynamic mixing internally, we're talking about tools that allow us to provide a cinematic focus by altering the standard audio response to a given game situation. We use this extensively during missions, but we also do some off-mission dynamic mixing. Our static mix is applied to categories, so we slice sounds up into categories, mix those. They're arranged in a hierarchy, so volume cascades down to child categories. And once we've got our static mix, we can create mix patches which apply offsets to these categories. And these patches can either be applied globally to the whole game, or we can apply them to groups of entities, which is great from a mission point of view. A car chase, for example, we can mix the player car, an enemy car, and ambient traffic completely independently. Our approach to setting all this up on the mission side relies on an audio assistant working with level design, blocking out the major chunks of a mission, and defining all the audio scenes that we're going to want to potentially do things with. Also setting up all the groups, ensuring the entities are added and removed at the right points. And once all that's done, it means a sound designer can come along, rely on that infrastructure being there, and figure out where they want to add focus, where they want to polish the mix, and kind of act as if that was all automatic. And on the dynamic mixing side also, we look for opportunities to replace assets to help tell the story. This can be pretty subtle, and one of my favorite examples early on in the game, the player is forced under duress to drive a vehicle through a big glass window. And the player has driven the vehicle to the scene. There's a short cinematic where they're told what to do, and then they get control back and they drive through the window. We actually swap the engine out during that small cutscene for something that's a bit more aggressive and angry sounding. And it's hopefully not something the player notices explicitly, but it just helps to reinforce the emotion of the scene. GTA games have always utilized vehicle radio as the primary source of music. And in GTA 5, we did add an original soundtrack, interactive score, for the first time. So we had to consider the interaction between the radio and the score, and how could we transition between the two in a musically pleasing way. Ideally, our approach with music is that the user should never really notice the music starting or stopping. They should just feel the emotional effect. So we added a lot of new controls to allow us to blur the boundaries of what would have traditionally been front-end radio or radio positioned in a car versus what's now score. Another example of that is also near the start of the game. The player drives their car, probably with radio on. They drive the car into a mission location. The camera cuts to establishing shot, and the player doesn't have control as the car is driven around the back of the building. And in the past, we would have had to choose between the radio being on or off. That was the granularity of control. One of the things we added here, which is kind of, I suppose, obvious, but it really worked well, was just a fade over several seconds. So as the camera cuts to the cinematic shot, the radio fades out over time. So that was the radio that the player was hearing because they were driving the car, but we avoid a jarring transition when they're no longer driving the car. In terms of transitioning from score back to radio, a common issue we had to deal with was at the end of a mission where the game transitioned seamlessly back to open world play. So maybe you were escaping from the police, or some sort of car chase ends a mission, and we're using score to help drive the emotion there. When you successfully evade whoever is chasing you, we have to get back to radio which is kind of tricky. So we take advantage of misdirection here, and generally we'll wait for a conversation either in car or over the mobile phone, and while the music is ducked for the conversation, we'll do a quick fade to some radio music, which is appropriate, kind of similar sounding to the score in some vague sense. And then when they finish talking, we bring the volume back up and you're onto radio, and hopefully you didn't notice the switch. If we don't have any dialogue that we can hide that behind, we did add support for the radio DJ to come in and start speaking over the score, so we can use the same technique there. The score is playing, it's ducked, the radio DJ starts to speak, and while they're talking, and hopefully you're focusing on what they're saying, we'll do a quick fade to a radio track and fade back up. And our approach to setting all this up is quite similar to dynamic mixing, actually. We'll typically go through with level design and block out all of the major events throughout a mission that we might want to have some sort of musical response. And once all these events are being triggered, our music team can hook up the responses to that in the audio tool, so they can decide whether the music's changing stem mix or whether it's going to start or stop, or maybe it's just going to keep doing whatever it's doing. Our score is 8 stereo stems. We add one-shots on top of that, and moods define for us the balance of the different stems. A mood is activated by script, and it can contain multiple stem mixes, so over time we can keep it interesting by transitioning between variation. So as a single area of the game, vehicles are a good vertical slice to analyze, because you'll find the approaches we take here kind of apply generally elsewhere as well. The sound of an individual vehicle in GTA is represented by multiple layers. We've got the detail and close sounds, things like the metallic tick of an engine cooling, or the crunch of the broken glass if you drive away after smashing your headlamp. The mid and far stuff tends to be more noise-based, road noise and that kind of thing. Busy freeways are obviously a characteristic feature of Los Angeles, which is the inspiration for our fictional Los Santos. So it's important to us that we create a nice solution for those. So we do have custom highway assets that are driven by the density of traffic, the distance, but also if you go underneath the freeway, we switch to more rumble and bassy stuff, so it feels like there's a weight of traffic above you. And another characteristic sound from LA is you often hear distant cars burning off from the lights, maybe, or driving aggressively. But it's really important in GTA that we don't fake things too much. We don't want the player to hear something that they can't ever experience themselves. So we did render those out from the game, so they're using in-game assets. We rendered them out. The performance is authored by the sound designer, and then the processing is done offline, but they are representative of the sound of the cars that you can drive in the game yourself. And finally, we have our city noise, which is our macro-level wash of noise, dependent on the area. It modulates as you move around. And the end result requires all these layers working together to form a cohesive whole. On the individual vehicle side, we moved from a loop-based engine system on 4 to a granular engine system on 5. That was one of the main advances from a sound quality and fidelity point of view. On top of the engine, we layer a number of synthesized intake induction sounds, transmission, of course, traction and aero sounds as well. But we also add various layers of creaks and bangs based on the vehicle movement. This really provides a connection for the player. It's a little bit like shadows or footstep sounds, in that it grounds you to the world as your car is bouncing around if you're getting some percussive feedback. For the engines, we record in-gear acceleration runs on an airfield. We'll generally accelerate from idle to top revs, lift off and coast, back to idle. Cut that into 3 chunks. We've got our idle, our acceleration, and our deceleration. And we'll do this in first gear and second gear usually. Depending on the cars, second gear is usually our acceleration run. We aim for about 7 seconds of data, and usually first gear for the decel, because it's a bit more aggressive. We love using miniature Omni mics for this because they're tiny and lightweight and very easy to place. And we built a custom shock mount suction cup you can see there, which we use for exterior mic placement. So once we've recorded and mixed and edited the assets, we take them into our granular pipeline. First stage of that is frequency RPM detection. The sound designer guides this by selecting the fundamental frequency they want to track. tells the tool how many cylinders the engine has, and then the tool figures out the pitch curve. The second stage there, we use autocorrelation and bias towards zero crossings to break the data into grains. And then finally, we take it into this tool where we can preview it and also add loop markup. So a common issue with granular systems is they sound great when they're moving, but obviously you need to do something when you hold a steady state RPM. You can't just continually play the same grain. So our approach to that relies on the sound designer marking up, finding regions within the granular asset where the character doesn't change too much. There's no cam change or exhaust pop or burble. They'll mark up these regions, and the runtime can pitch correct and randomize them to provide variation. And if you hold a steady state RPM in game, you'll hear a blend of the two adjacent loops along with the pure granular data. The other thing we added that was really handy here was we can optionally optimize the asset at this point. So if your granular data is a little bit too long, once we've sliced it into grains, you can pick a region and just discard a percentage of the grains. So it's a nice, fast way of cutting things down to size. We retain separate engine and exhaust data. So we run two granular synths in game, one for the engine, one for the exhaust. And this is purely for mix reasons. It allows us to have the exhaust audible over a greater distance. And for a front engine car, it means that we can cone the engine out the front and the exhaust out the back. And that leads to a pleasing transition as a car drives past. We also take advantage of the fact that we're not making a simulation game. We have complete creative control over what a car should sound like. So we'll often mix and match different engines with different exhausts. Because the granular system keeps everything in sync from a pitch point of view, it gives us great flexibility there. We have to consider in a GTA game that the player can get into any car. So there's no really hard cutoff between an NPC car and a player car. So we need to ensure that when that happens, we can transition seamlessly from one to the other. So the approach we took on 5, our NPC engines use only the loop data that's marked up in the previous slide by the sound designer. We extract that into its own bank. That forms the NPC engine. And because it's a subset of the player data, we can always guarantee that we can seamlessly transition from one to the other very quickly without any audible discontinuity. Another cool feature we added here was the ability to sync oscillators to a multiple of the granular clock. So that's the fundamental frequency of the engine. And this is great because we can do subharmonic sweeteners, things like that, in sync with the engine layered on top. And once all that's mixed together, we apply some real-time DSP post-processing to add character and also to help with supporting modifications to the engine. So we make the cars sound different as they're modified. So typically that's EQ and filtering. We also do a little bit of real-time transient shaping on some assets. So one of the entirely new features that we wanted to add for GTA 5 was a real-time synthesis toolkit. We were particularly excited by the potential for fully responsive and continuously variable procedural assets that you can't necessarily create with samples alone. But it was really important to us that sound designers of varying technical backgrounds could benefit from this. So we really had to ensure that the tool was going to encourage experimentation, be as accessible as possible, and generally be fun to use and spend time with. So to that end, we put quite a lot of effort into polishing the user experience. So this is what the tool looks like. Fairly standard modular concepts. You drop modules in. The inputs are on the left, outputs on the right. Wire them together with cables. You can see there's a real emphasis on real-time visualization wherever possible. Every input and output has a real-time waveform display showing the data. The cables are animated to show the direction of the signal. But they also show the amplitude of the signal. So you'll see this oscillator cable is pulsing in time with the data it's carrying. The biquad obviously is showing a real-time frequency response that's animated based on the input values. The waveforms themselves, you can pause, zoom in, scroll around, generally inspect the signal. We also highlight any samples that are out with the full-scale range. So although we don't clip internally, this just gives you an idea of where your signal might be a little too hot, and if you were to send it to an output, it would clip. So you can see the red samples there are greater than 0 dB FS. The reflections just to look cool. Another feature the sound designers really like is you can solo any pin. So you just hold the shift key over any input or output, and you can immediately hear the signal at that point. So it's really fast to work out what's going on and figure out what's contributing to the sound you're hearing. The cables are color-coded. The green cables are control data. The blue cables are audio data. So in this case, the envelope's generating a control signal. You might have noticed the oscillator is generating an audio signal, but that's hooked up to a green control pin. The tool is smart enough to figure out what you probably mean there is the full-scale oscillator sweep. We also have some diagnostic modules. The one I'm about to drop in is a chart recorder, which just graphs the signal over time. This sound is the equivalent of programmer art, by the way. So the chart recorder can show either control data, or you can render audio data with it as well. And our output module has some simple metering and obviously the spectrum display as well. So I've got a few assets from the game. These are real in-game synths. This is an air conditioning unit, a pleasing rattle. These speakers sound interesting. This is our procedural dubstep generator. It can create infinite dubstep. This is a bicycle sprocket. This is metal on stone. There's two main elements, which we can addition there. So, thank you. So overall, this experiment was a great success. We used it to create a wide variety of assets, and particularly asset components. So it wasn't always the case that a synth would provide the ultimate answer, but usually in combination with other techniques like sample-based or granular-based, it was a really useful tool. Particularly good for noise-based sounds. Noise obviously compresses very badly. So if you have noisy assets, they typically generate lots of compression artifacts. And usually you'll need quite a long loop if you want it to sound flat. Therefore it's a great candidate for this kind of synthesis. We also use this tool to enable sound designer authored effects chains. So where we would have previously coded up some custom bit of DSP, we can now allow a sound designer to have a hook where they can create a custom synth. And that's used extensively in our vehicles, for example. The post-processing is per vehicle, separately for engine exhaust. And it means that the sound designers have the full range of modulation sources and variables to drive whatever processing they want to do. We used similar techniques or approaches for our headset speech in games. So one of the big gameplay features that was added in this game was the ability to switch character mid-mission or during key moments. And that means that you can play certain parts of the mission from different perspectives. So we were no longer able to bake our headset processing offline. So we used this tool to create a distortion patch that was applied at runtime. You might be interested to hear that 35% of the voices that were in the original video were synthesized. 50% were samples. So runtime performance is obviously key for this to be useful. That goes back to what I said earlier, where there's no point creating something that looks great that's too expensive to use in game. So we implemented a fairly sophisticated asset pipeline. Similar to compiler backend, we take the graph of modules that the sound designers created. We apply several optimizations, things like constant folding, where we look for static values fed into some math that we can process offline rather than in the console, but also static branch illumination, which is great because it means a sound designer can leave some extra diagnostic stuff in their patch, or maybe different approaches where they've picked one out of a few options. And as long as it's not contributing to the sound, the final sound of the asset, we don't pay any cost. We strip it out, and there's no memory or CPU cost. And after all these optimizations are applied, the compiler spits out a list of procedural operations that run on a custom virtual machine. Because each of these operations has a very fixed cost at runtime, it means that we can measure that cost on all the target platforms and use that to provide real-time performance information to the sound designers. So as they're working on their asset, we're running it through the compiler optimizer stuff. We're performing static performance analysis on the resulting bytecode and informing the user exactly how expensive or otherwise their synth is. That's great because it means we can give them budgets to work toward, whereas it's not always intuitive, clearly, how expensive an asset's going to be just by looking at it. So the kind of unreadable text there is actually a disassembly of the air conditioning sound that you heard. And according to the performance stats, it costs about 1.5 times an MP3 decode, which clearly in that case is a great win because you would need more than a few voices to create the same amount of variety and variation over time. We also feed these performance stats into our voice management. It used to be nice and simple where every voice had the same cost. And we could rely on that to work to a fixed voice count. Whereas now, an asset can be completely varying cost depending on the design. Same is true for granular. Samples are nice and easy. So rather than working to fixed voice costs, we now work to a CPU budget. And each asset has a cost associated with it, which we subtract from our budget. Once we run out of CPU, we stop allocating voices. So that means that our runtime voice count fluctuates depending on the complexity of the assets that are being played back. The other big challenge for virtualization, which, as I said, is something we've relied on for years, we have no way of knowing how loud a synth asset is going to be until we synthesize it. It's not like a wave where we can analyze it and store the peak value offline. And sadly, there's no magic for that. It's an impossible problem. So we have to solve it through process rather than any technology. So we ensure that sound designers create synths that are loud, basically. They master to a particular peak level, and they try and ensure that any dynamic range is applied externally, so through the sound hierarchy, rather than inside the synth itself. And we do check for that at runtime. Every synth that plays in a debug build, we meter it and see how loud it got. And if it didn't manage to achieve a certain threshold, it will get added to a report, and we can ask a sound designer to look into it. The other thing we did there, because obviously a sound designer here is free to create potential havoc with filters blowing up and things, we did add automated testing of all of our assets. So you run the game with a certain command line. It synthesizes 10 seconds of every asset and randomizes the input parameters, looking for any values out with the normal range, non-finite values, that kind of thing. So that helps us ensure that we don't blow anything up. Still happens sometimes. So our approach to creating an immersive world on the audio side relies on a set of coherent rules that are applied to everything by default. So we consider what does the environment sound like, how are sounds affected by the environment, but also how does the environment respond to the sounds that are played back within it. The majority of our natural world ambient audio is driven by audio zones, ambient zones. These are placed by sound designers and define an activation volume and a playback volume. And when the player is in the activation volume, the zone is active. When it's active, it will trigger sounds randomly positioned within the playback volume. Rules are used to define when and how often the sound is allowed to play. That might be time of day dependent or weather dependent, that sort of thing. We don't use any streams for this. All of our ambience is sequenced out of sounds. And this helps ensure smooth transitions. We really want to avoid any hard cuts. We don't want to cross a threshold and hear something start or stop. So by breaking it all down into small parts and sequencing them positioned in the world, it ensures that as you move through the world, you hear a natural evolution of sound. And I hinted earlier, everything it's important to us that everything in GTA sounds plausible. So any sound in the ambience has to be something that you could conceivably come across in the game. Ideally, everything should be around the corner or one block away, so you're never aware that it's not associated with something that's really happening at that moment in the game. And you might have noticed, probably didn't, in GTA 4 we didn't have any dogs in our ambience track. You never hear a dog bark. If you've been to New York, you obviously do hear dogs bark, but we didn't have dogs in the game, so it would have broken our world if we had included the sound of barking dogs. It was a very good day when we added dogs to GTA 5. So our overall approach in GTA 4, as I mentioned, was really similar. That's the map of 4 on screen. We created 86 zones, 57 rows, about 200 emitters. You can probably guess where the next slide is going to go. So yeah, we created a lot more, safe to say. We had to optimize a lot of systems to enable that growth. 11 times the number of zones, 21 times the number of rows, and 2.5 times the static emitters. But actually on GTA 4, we used static emitters for a whole bunch of things. On GTA 5, they're only ever used for music placement, so radio emitters. So yeah, massive growth. We also extended our zones to support different shapes and orientations. So on GTA 4, they were all axis-aligned boxes. In 5, we support spheres, and the boxes can be orientated arbitrarily. We also added support to our rules to support more complex positioning systems. So we can now have a sound which tracks a line that's placed in the world, which we use for some waterfalls and pipe systems. And we also have a follow listener mode where the sound is positioned at the listener if you're inside the zone, and it's left at the nearest point on the zone boundary if you're outside the zone. So the sounds that are played back within the world are affected by a consistent set of rules. And it's important that those rules are consistent because it helps create a world that's really believable. So our standard distance behavior applies a combination of high-pass filtering, low-pass filtering, and we increase the reverb sounds with distance. So sound that's further away should be more diffuse when it reaches the listener. We can override all of this per sound, but we typically don't do that very often. We don't, well, sorry, I should say we override the scale all the time, so we control how loud a sound is and therefore how it should, how much of the environment it should fill, but we rarely change the curves themselves, and we try and stick to the same behavior where possible. Our occlusion system applies low-pass filtering and also reduces directionality, so the panning becomes a little less discrete if a sound is occluded. We have 2 different occlusion systems, one for interiors and one for the outside world. On the interior side, it's a nice story. We've got portals and we've got rooms, and we can track the path that the sound should take through those rooms, and that allows us to do repositioning if a sound's occluded at the nearest portal, work out the best path, that kind of thing. Sadly, in the outside world, we don't have any of that data, so we have to rely on line-of-sight probes. And we can't afford very many of those. In fact, our entire occlusion system uses around 5 probes per frame, which makes it quite difficult to get really extreme results without the risk of being broken. Generally, when presented with a problem like that, we will always take a more conservative approach. We don't ever want to get into a situation where you hear a sound be occluded when it shouldn't be occluded. That's far worse than a sound not being as occluded as it might be if you were really there. So yeah, we tend to tone things down a little bit in the outside world. We do farm an occlusion volume around the player based on these probes, and we do filter sounds accordingly, but we have to err on the side of caution there. We use a number of custom reflection techniques where we get a lot of value from it. So one example of that is gunfire. We author custom echo sounds, and they're positioned based on the environment. So maybe a tall building or something like that, we'll find a reflection point and position the echo sound there. And for the vehicle that the player is driving, if you enter a tunnel, you might have heard in the intro video there, we do position 2 reflection delay lines, variable delay lines, on the edges of the tunnel. So the delay time is based on speed of sound there. So if you drive toward the edge, the wall, you'll hear the Doppler shift on the reflection, which is really cool and really sells the space. We don't use any traditional listener reverb at all. Our reverb is entirely source-based. Ideally, we would be able to create completely bespoke reverb for every source, but obviously that's impossible or not affordable. So instead, we approximate this using 3 4-channel reverb buses, a small, medium, and large. And depending on the environment that the source is in, we'll send to some combination of those to create the response we're looking for. Because these are 4-channel, they can obviously be positioned in whatever way we want, and we can position the dry separately to the wet where that's useful. And it's also important for us that the environment responds to the sounds. So the natural ambience that I talked about, there's natural ways it responds to loud sounds. Birds might freak out if you fire a gun. Dogs might bark, now that we've got dogs. But we also use it for a dramatic effect. We'll hush insect beds in some situations when you fire a gun, and this really makes it feel eerie and puts the player on edge. We tag up resonant objects in the world with their resonant sounds. So these are things like metal dumpsters or shipping containers. And these sounds are triggered based on percussive transient sounds in the world, like a gunshot. If you fire your weapon next to a shipping container, you should hear that ring with sympathetic resonance. And because these are tagged to the objects, they're positioned nicely around you. And as you move through the space, you get a nice response there. We tend to keep that stuff very subtle, very tight roll-off, but it does add a lot. And for objects that rattle, chain link fence being a great example, we'll tag those sounds up with a rattle element and apply shock waves to that. So shock waves we trigger from explosions. They're just a very simple sphere that grows over time, but we also attach them to loud vehicles, helicopters and trains being good examples. So if a train starts to arrive at a station, you'll hopefully hear bins sitting on the ground start to rattle as it approaches. This kind of tagging clearly requires a lot of effort. I mean, we talked about the size of the audio assets, but the size of the game assets is also crazy. So it is a massive amount of manual effort, and the reward is relatively subtle. But it does go a long way to helping the world feel more solid and immersive, and ultimately helps us create the sort of depth and subtlety that we're striving for. So that is the end of my talk, right on time. Thank you. Thanks. I think there is some time for questions now, if anyone has any, or maybe everyone wants lunch. Do you want to start? There's a mic, sorry, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Hi. I think you said you had like 30 sound types. Is that what you called them?
Yeah.
How are those created? Is that a purely code thing, or?
Yeah. So we have 31. They're created by programmers based on sound designer requirements, but they are a combination of code and data. So you define the parameters for the sound type. The UI for the tool is driven entirely based on that. So there's a data component, and then there's the runtime code component that implements the logic.
So I just want to say thank you for sharing this. I think it's really amazing to hear how you guys did this, and I think you're light years ahead of anything in procedural I've ever heard.
Thank you.
So it's really inspiring. I was wondering, how did you, how difficult was it to get all that procedural audio to be high performance? Because it seems like that's a critical element.
Sure. You mean the synthesis stuff in particular? Yeah, it was. I mean, it was always the plan, obviously, that it had to be high performance. So the whole thing was engineered from the ground up with that in mind. Yeah, it was a key consideration, certainly. Because we implemented an architecture that was pretty quick to run, we didn't actually have any trouble. In fact, we were pleasantly surprised with the amount of processing we could afford once we had the tools in place. But yeah, that was because it was performance first from a design standpoint.
Thank you.
Great talk. I have a question about the vehicle engine rendering.
Sure.
Were you happy with the granular system that you created, and what would you do to improve it in the future?
That's a good question. Yeah, we were certainly delighted with the improvements comparing to previous GTAs, and I think the cars sound really good. There's a number of improvements we'd like to look into for the future. If we had more memory, then improving the variation would be great. So currently we have a single acceleration and deceleration asset, which is okay because the physics is always a little bit different per gear and depending on how the user's driving. But it would be very cool if we could afford different layers, maybe throttle-dependent layers, so we have part throttle, full throttle, and maybe different gears, that kind of thing. So I think variation would certainly be an interesting thing to push.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hiya.
Hi.
In terms of bank management,
Sure.
how did you deal with obviously such a large amount of assets streaming in, and also in terms of engines? If you've got the player car as granular, the rest of the guys as rev bands, if you don't know what car someone is about to jump into, do you quickly dump stuff? And
Sure. So yeah, we tend to create pretty custom solutions for each system from a streaming point of view. On the car side, we have a single player bank that we can load in, or a slot that we can load into, and then we have, I think, 6 or 7 MPC slots that we can load into. So yeah, if you start getting into a vehicle, we'll very quickly try and grab the asset for the player version of that car. Thankfully, the animation of getting in takes a little while, so we usually have enough time for that. I don't think I've ever heard it. I mean, it could fall back to the MPC version, but I don't think I've actually ever heard that happen because we get the data in time. We've always got a few seconds there.
okay, thank you.
I was wondering what type of mixing technique were you using when, for example, you're driving the car and there's a radio station going on, and then you might be also talking on your cell phone, so there's a bunch of different elements happening in the same time.
Yeah.
So were you using like a hierarchy of like ducking and mixing?
Yeah, that's right. We duck the radio sort of automatically for any scripted conversation, any scripted dialogue. So we take it down 9 dB or something, I think, automatically if anyone's talking. For score, we sometimes do that if we need to, although we prefer the score to be sympathetic to what's going on. So if there's a section in the game where people are going to be talking for a while, we'll pick a score mix that's not too invasive there. But yeah, ducking's always our fallback for that stuff.
Also, one more question was about the radio stations. There's a given amount of tracks per each station.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what kind of engine mechanism you were using to not have it loop in a certain way where if you re-enter a car, it might be playing like the same track.
Sure.
That there's some kind of randomization in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's something that we worked really hard to maximize the time between hearing the same track on the radio as much as possible. So our radio stations are broken up. We actually have 2 types of radio station, dynamic and mixed. Mixed stations are where we work with a particular DJ and he produces, or she produces a really cool mix, which is a single entity. Those we have to just keep playing looping, but they tend to be long enough that hopefully you don't hear repetition. The majority of the stations are dynamic, and that means the music tracks are individual assets. The adverts, the DJ banter, including lines where the DJ speaks over the intro.
Right.
So those ones we mark up intro regions and outro regions, and we have separate speech for the DJ, and he can speak at the correct point. And the adverts and the idents and all that kind of thing are separate. And we track the history on that. So we just ensure, like I said, we maximize the time between hearing repeats. Unfortunately, that doesn't work very well for multiplayer. And in GTA Online, we do sync the radio tracks. So you should hear what your mates are hearing. But obviously, there's no way of ensuring you've not heard that track in a different session recently. So, yeah.
Well, congratulations. I think that's a monumental achievement.
Thank you.
Hey there. It was a great talk, great game. Quick question about the dialogue. When you guys interrupt the dialogue during a sequence and then you pick it back up, it's always, between words. It's never inside of a word. I'm wondering if you set those hit points in advance or you have something procedural?
No, that's all manual. Yeah, it makes a massive difference to it feeling natural, doesn't it? But sadly, that's just a lot of work. We tag up repeat points, we call them, throughout a line of dialogue. and those are the resume points, I guess, where we can pick up from again.
Thanks.
Thanks.
So I was just thinking a little bit more about you said. Actually, one more question.
Sure.
Can you give me a general number about the budget on the CPU and the SPU that was dedicated to audio?
So I think I'm right in saying that we had about one SPU for audio, and that was everything. So that's all the mixing, DSP, but also all the sound processing, and yeah, not including the game level stuff, I guess, but all the engine level stuff. I'm pretty sure that was about one SPU, and that includes MP3 decode as well.
Oh. And on the CPU?
None, virtually.
Wow. Okay, mine is severely blown.
Hi. Real-time audio synthesis module is so cool, but how much required the system required CPU power?
The GPU power. Yeah, we're not doing any GPU power. The only
CPU.
CPU.
Oh, yeah. Sound memory or CPU to generate the real-time audio synthesis.
So how much CPU are we using?
Yeah.
Is that the question? Yeah, so on PS3 it's about one of the SPUs, and that's to do all the audio. I think it's, if I remember rightly, it's maybe a quarter of that is PCM generation, which is our MP3 decode and our synthesis and things like that.
So how much the sounds, how many sounds can call simultaneously those real-time audio synthesis sounds?
So how many are you asking at once? There isn't a fixed limit. We have a fixed limit of 96 physical voices, which are voices that are rendered. All of those could be synths if it happened to be the case where 96 of the loudest sounds in the game were synthesized. That won't ever happen, I guess. But yeah, the overall budget is well, it fluctuates basically how many things we're playing. It's entirely dependent on the assets. So, like I said, the air conditioning unit sample or the synth that I like here, that costs the equivalent to about 1.5 MP3 decodes. So, if we were playing a sample, we could do 1.5 of those per aircon. So,
yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. All right, I think we're out of time, so thank you very much.